Please join me. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the light that shines in the darkness of American politics and will lead us to a new day.
I feel like he gives us hope, something that America really needs right now.
I would vote for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for president.
I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I'm running for President of the United States, and I approve this message.
So to Roger Stone and Steve Bannon, no, you don't want to run with Trump?
No, I don't. No, I'm not going to run for with President Trump, but I'm flattered by the offer.
Okay.
One of the things that I've tried to do in this campaign is to identify innovative, common sense solutions to some of these apparently intractable problems that keep the political parties at each other's throats. So tonight I want to describe a win-win-win policy that could solve two of the principal issues that are keeping the political parties apart. One of those issues is the wave of illegal immigration that is currently coming across the border. The other issue has to do with the integrity of our electoral process and the guarantee that every American should have a right to vote. So what could be a solution that would solve both of those problems? The answer to that question is to make passport cards free. A passport card is a picture identification that is issued by the federal government that can be used as a substitute for a passport. It's an accredited federal ID. They are issued by every one of the 33,000 federal post offices in our country. Almost every American has a post office within easy driving or walking distance of their homes. Currently, those passports cost $65. And for many Americans, and especially poor Americans, that price tag puts passport cards out of reach. Making passport cards free will solve another important problem. And that problem is that millions of Americans today are living as second-class citizens because they do not have a government-issued photo ID. Without a passport or driver's license, you can't open a bank account. You can't board an airplane, you can't check into a hotel, and you can't visit your child at school. If you can't open a bank account, you cash your salary check at a check cashing operation that could take as much as 10% of the value of that check. Shouldn't we all be concerned that the difficulty in accessing a government-issued photo ID has left millions of Americans at the mercy of check cashers and payday lenders, an $11 billion industry? In the interest of pure fairness, we need to make sure that every American can obtain an ID. And I'm not talking about a new form of universal or mandatory identification. In fact, this proposal removes the incentives and nullifies the arguments of those people who've been urging universal mandatory IDs or vaccine passports. Rather, we just make passport cards available to every American who can't afford them, and we assist them in obtaining the necessary paperwork. No one in this country needs to be a second-class citizen. And then there are the two other benefits to this plan. Voter ID laws will no longer be unfair to people who cannot afford or obtain an ID. That's why it will please liberals. My friends, the civil rights leaders Andrew Young, Al Sharpton, and Martin Luther King III are all supporting this proposal. Conservatives will be happy because this proposal goes a long way in fixing our broken electoral system. And everyone will have to prove their identity before they vote. The second benefit is that we can now make employers accountable for hiring people illegally. That alone will stem the flood of illegal immigration into this country. If you can't find a job in this country, and everybody in the world knows that, then there's no incentive to come here illegally. Right now, employers like construction firms almost never require that prospective employees show a photo ID. And it would be impractical to do so, since so many of the working poor in this country don't have an ID. The only ID that is customarily demanded by employers of new employees is a Social Security card, which has no picture, which is easy to fabricate, and which are often passed from person to person. By making it easy for employers to skirt the laws that forbid them from hiring illegal aliens, we are putting the firms that actually hire working Americans and union members in a tremendous disadvantage in the marketplace. Once we've sealed the border and made it impossible for illegal aliens to work in this country, we can then talk about a path to citizenship for people who are already here and about opening the gates to make sure that there are workers able to visit this country from abroad. When this proposal was originally advanced by civil rights leaders on the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it was embraced by people of both political parties, including President Clinton, President Carter, and President Bush. Many of those civil rights leaders have persistently petitioned President Biden to take this common sense step to end the immigration problem and to ensure that every American can vote, and to reassure Americans on both sides of the political spectrum that the voting system in our country has integrity and cannot be cheated. In fact, today, on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, leading civil rights leaders, including Andrew Young, Al Sharpton, Martin Luther King III, and many others, again renewed that request to President Biden. And yet President Biden has refused. When I'm President of the United States, during my first week in office, I will issue an executive order to every postmaster in this country to begin issuing free passport cards to every American who can't afford one. As I said at the outset, this is a common sense proposal. The only real argument about it is that it will deplete a revenue stream that is currently going to the U.S. Post Office and the federal government. Over decades, that could end up being a couple of $1 billion. But right now, we're putting $150 billion into making sure that Ukraine can have democracy. We ought to be able to put $1 billion or so into protecting our democracy at home. I ask all of you to give this proposal careful consideration and your support, and write to President Biden and ask him to do the right thing prior to the 2024 election so that every American can vote and that the election has integrity.
I think you've praised other people who are running as independents. Would you yourself ever do that?
I don't think so.
Why?
Because I'm a Democrat. I really feel like the Democratic Party has lost its way. If you look at all the issues that I stand for, if you go through the issues that my father and my uncle stood for, I can go and check every one of those boxes. And those are the issues that I believe. I believe, the Democratic Party traditionally was anti-war. We were against censorship. We were not a good home for the neocons. Those were Republicans, a very aggressive, pugnacious, belligerent foreign policy that they represent, which the Democrats are always against. We were the party that was against Wall Street instead of inviting Wall Street to strip mine the American public and destroy the American middle class. My Democratic Party was the party that represents the middle class and represents the poor in the country. And I want to bring the Democratic Party back to those original values.
We support RFK Jr.'s presidential campaign simply because it's built off of truth and honesty. Mr. Kennedy's policies on economics, civil liberties, and revitalization will ensure America is on a proper path. Mr. Kennedy is not only my friend, he's America's friend. Let's heal the divide, get out, and vote. Kennedy 24!
It was weird what happened to I'm sure you noticed this, that all these comedians stopped being funny at the beginning of COVID. All the people who we laughed at for 20 years, and none of them were funny anymore because they weren't allowed to laugh at what was happening. It was really happening. They all had to go along with the narrative. It was shocking. You were the first guy who was being funny about it. The humor is such an important part of change and criticism and political dissent. As for Jimmy Kimmel and Colbert and all of those guys, they went dead. What happened?
Fauci said that if hospitals get any more overcrowded, they're going to have to make some very tough choices about who gets an ICU bed. That choice doesn't seem so tough to me. Vaccinated person having a heart attack? Yes, come right on in. We'll take care of you. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo? Rest in peace, Wheezy.
I feel like they let down comedy. Now, I know Jimmy Kimmel. He was a sweetheart of a guy. I always thought he was a nice guy. He was nice to me. And so it was a heartbreak to see that. And Stephen Colbert was a hero of mine comedically. I thought that show he did was the best satirical comedy show in the history.
Yeah. Please welcome Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Mr. Kennedy!
And turns out he became that character. When he started hosting his late night show on CBS, he became the character he used to be, just repeats talking points and establishment. I mean, it was nuts to watch. It was heartbreaking. And so I appreciate the nice words from you on that. And I feel, you know, I used to always be very proud to be a member of the stand-up comedy community. And boy, it really left me.
If you like this video and you want to help me become president of the United States, go to Kennedy24.com and donate now.
You know, you've got a Republican mega donor funding one of your main super PACs. You've got Ron DeSantis saying he'd put you in his cabinet. Key allies of Donald Trump are saying they want you to be Trump's running mate. Why are you Republicans' favorite Democrat?
Well, you know, I started out this campaign saying that I wanted to end the toxic polarization that is dividing America, that I think is as dangerous as any time since the American Civil War. And, you know, a lot of people agree with that. A lot of Americans agree with that. They talk about the future in apocalyptical terms because of the division and don't see where there's a good end. And I feel like somebody needs to stand up and stop talking so much, focusing so much on the issues that divide us, and talk instead about the values that bring us together. And I will talk to anybody. You know, I'm happy to talk to Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I don't attack either of them personally. I talk about their issues critically.
But for Democratic voters, when they hear that a Republican is funding one of your PACs, maybe that gives them pause.
Well, but he's not the only funder of my PAC, and
he's a big one.
Well, yeah, but I've got ones that are equally big who are Democrats. I think that's a good thing. The problem is today that is frightening is that with AI, with, you know, artificial intelligence, and with all of these surveillance, like facial recognition systems, the satellite systems that are now, I think we're going to have 415,000 low-altitude satellites where they can look at every square inch of the Earth at 24 hours a day. We're all under surveillance. Your GPS, your cell phone is spying on you. We're carrying around these devices that are all spying on us, or all have the capacity to spy on us, and of course they are.
To what end?
The thing that's financing most of this are commercial and mercantile interests. I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience where you say, you know, I need a better mattress, I can't sleep at night, and then 20 minutes later you get this, you know, a bunch of mattress ads on your cell phone. Well, they're listening to you. If you are doing something that involves dissent or disobedience to government mandates, it's quite possible that there's some government agency that's keeping track of that.
Have you experienced any retaliation in the since the pandemic? Have you seen any overt forms of retaliation against you by the intelligence community?
We come under attack by bots almost daily at the Children's Health Defense, but you know, you don't know who's orchestrating it. It's all kind of obscure and invisible. Now, the CIA technically is not supposed to be spying on Americans in America, but the way that they get around that is they use the Five Eyes, which are the intelligence agencies from our 5 top allied countries, to do the spying, and then they share the information with the CIA.
Who are these people beholden to? What is their ultimate MO?
There may be no sinister motive at this moment in history. The problem is, and this is a solid rule, any power that the government has, it will also ultimately abuse the maximum extent possible. And it will never give back voluntarily. So now the question is, they may not be doing anything bad with it now. At any moment, that could change. If you like this video and you want to help me become president of the United States, go to Kennedy24.com and donate now.
One of the things though, that comes up when people start looking in other places for information are certain conspiracy theories, for example, about the 2020 election. Do you believe that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election?
I believe that he lost the 2020 election, but, look, I think elections can get stolen in this country.
Is that what happened in 2020?
In 2001, it was clearly, I think most Democrats believe it was stolen in 2001.
From Gore to Bush.
Yeah, and that it was stolen in 2004 from Kerry. Hillary Clinton has suggested that the 2016 election was stolen from her. Bernie Sanders, his supporters believe the election was stolen from him. I don't think Americans who suggest that election can be stolen, I think they should be listened to. Their evidence should be seen and considered, and they shouldn't be dismissed as people who are enemies of the United States. We have an election system that is broken because elections can be, tampered with. And we ought to fix that.
Do you believe that Trump tried to overturn the election results based on what you've seen?
What I've seen, it seems like he was trying to overturn it.
And is that, when you look at the fact that he's been indicted for that, is that an impeachable offense? I don't mean that in the official sense.
Well,
I mean it like disqualifying to be president again.
It may be impeachable if he broke a law. I was reading this morning that there's a Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that there's a provision that he may have violated.
Yeah.
And may or may not disqualify him, but that's up to the courts. And I'm not going to, get involved in that debate because it's inflammatory, and it really is not about the concerns that most Americans now have, which is feeding their family and paying their mortgages and paying their bills.
By the way, I think I can reach this for you.
Thank you, Steve. And I want to thank Jenny Rosen, who also co-hosted this event, and Steve and Lori for putting together such an amazing crowd of people. I got to meet a lot of you, and I really had fun here. I really wish my wife, Cheryl's been on the road with me for a week. And I think if she knew how fun this was going to be, and that she was going to get to see Johnny and Christina and Alex Hall sing, that she would have stayed. But I didn't get the message out. So she went home last night. Anyway, I want to thank all of you and Jason Skolka for the incredible food at this just fantastic venue. I asked Steve to let me start talking even though dinner's going, so you guys can still continue eating, because I know everybody wants to hear the musicians who are going to play, including me. But I want to talk a couple of minutes. I was in Manchester earlier this, I watched the Republican debate last night, and so much of it, a lot of it to me seemed tone deaf, because it was talking about a lot of things that when I go around, the people who support me in this race are people who are Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. And so I have overlapping constituencies with a lot of the people who I saw debating last night. But the things that they were talking about, that were not things that I'm hearing from people. I'm hearing a level of desperation in this country that I never, ever associated with the United States of America. And I've been traveling around this country, not just on this campaign, but that's what I do. I'm representing 1,000 families in Columbiana County, Ohio, whose lives were upended by the Norfolk Southern spill. Until recently, I was representing, until we won the case, 14,000 families in Spelter, West Virginia, who were poisoned by a DuPont smelter down there, and another 10,000 families in eastern Ohio who were poisoned by PFOAs from a different DuPont plant. And then, I have clients all over this country who got cancer from Roundup. So I spent a lot of time sitting at kitchen tables with people and understanding, what the pressures are in their lives. And, I'm seeing Americans living in a way that I saw in Latin America when I was a kid. And people having lost hope in this country and believing for the first time in American history that their kids would have lives that were less than them. And most Americans now feel that way. There was a kid who came to the opening of our headquarters in Manchester, and he waited in a long line because I did selfies with like 200 or 300 people. He was the last person in line. And he said he was 22 years old and that he had never voted before, never participated in politics. But he was working in my campaign because he wanted to have hope for our country, hope for himself, and pride in our country. Earlier that week, there was a poll that came out that showed that in 1985, American kids between 18 and 35 years old, 85% of them said they were proud to be American. And that same poll taken last week showed that actually 39% said now that they're proud to be American. And that to me is one of the most heartbreaking data points that I've seen, of many, many data points I've seen since I started this campaign, because that was such an important asset to me growing up, is the pride that I had in America and all of the evidence that that pride was based on reality. And this kid said he's worried that he'll never pay his student loans. And my wife, who was part of the working poor until she was 35 years old, did not, until she got her break on Curb Your Enthusiasm, paid off her student loans that year. If she hadn't gotten that break, she would not have paid them off. And the tuition that he's paying is about double what she was paying. It's 7 times what I paid for tuition. So, these kids that don't have any, they're going to live under that burden for decades. But even worse, the classic American promise was that if you worked hard, if you paid by the rules, that you would be able to own a house, pay for a mortgage, support your family, go on a summer vacation, and have something left for your retirement from one job. And that is a rarity today. And this kid is looking at, he wants to buy a house and have a family. But like lots of people that age, I have 7 kids in that age bracket. And their friends, I don't know any of their friends who have bought a house. And they're all living with their parents. And we see today, all of us have stories, and Steve was talking to me at dinner about all of these stories. He had this story about wanting to buy a house. People are about to sign a deal, and then somebody comes in with a cash offer at the last minute and takes the property from them. Yeah. And we know who that is. It's 3 big companies, it's BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, who own 88% of the S&P 500. Yeah. And who now have decided to buy all the single-family homes in America, and they're on target by 2030 to own 60% of them. And as they buy them and leave them empty, it puts pressure on rent, so that kids like this can't even afford to rent, to move out of their house. In the last 2 years, housing prices have gone from $215,000 average to $400,000. And the interest rates have gone from 1% to 7%. So that house is going to cost him 10 times what it would have cost him 2 years ago. And he doesn't have a hope. And these companies are part of it is inflation, but part of it is just a strategy of these companies. We were talking about this at dinner, that Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, is also on the board of directors of the World Economic Forum, which has promised us that, we're going to own nothing and be happy.
Yeah, right.
And they're actually on the way to at least meeting the first part of that process, that we will own nothing because they own so much of it. So today, the average income in this country is now $5,000 less than the cost of basic human needs, food, transportation, and housing. And so half of America, more than half, is making up that $5,000 by putting it on their credit cards, that deficit. And they're paying, and last week, we hit a milestone of $1 trillion in credit card debt for Americans. It's up $330 billion in the last 3 years. And those companies are charging 22% interest, which if the mafia did that, it would be called loan sharking and they'd go to jail. But when the bankers and credit card companies do it, it's just the cost of doing business. It's just, business as usual. And virtually all of those credit card companies and the banks are now owned by these three companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, which have devised all of these different ways of strip mining the wealth from the American public, and bankrupting the middle class in this country. And I'm seeing people when I sit at kitchen tables who are making terrible decisions, tough decisions every day. They're deciding. This kid said that he had to decide every week about whether, once a week, he had to decide whether to fill up his car or whether to eat dinner that day. And, people are deciding between gasoline and food, between food and medicine. Young couples are sitting in rental apartments with a baby in their arms who's crying and wondering whether that baby is $50 sick or $100 sick or $1,500 sick before they bring him to a hospital. 57% of the people in this country are not making enough, or do not make enough money, do not have $1,000 if there's an emergency in their family. And Cheryl and I were talking about that this week, about what happens when you're in that position and the engine light comes on in your car. It's the apocalypse. It's Armageddon for you to see that engine light come on and know that you're not going to have a ride to work and that there's no way you can afford it. And all of us have the experience of driving around in a car with the fuel gauge on empty. And the anxiety that gives you, it literally, you can't think of anything else. It makes you stupid. It takes IQ away from you. And then add to that maybe there's a toddler in the baby seat behind you, or two. And maybe you're going through a bad neighborhood. And the anxiety that you're living with, well, half of this country is living like that every day. That's what their day looks like. The whole day is like driving around with the fuel gauge on empty and not knowing, living paycheck to paycheck. None of this was talked about last night, and it's both the Democratic Party, Republican Party. Nobody's talking about this. And, but when I talk about it, Americans of every political stripe respond because this is their reality today. And I grew up at a time that economists call and social scientists call it Great Prosperity. It was a 50-year period after World War II, really, until 1971, when things started to change. But it was that 50-year period when the American middle class became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. When my uncle was president, we owned 50% of the wealth on Earth. Until 1971, we had more exports than every country in the world combined. So everybody wanted our stuff. When I traveled with my dad when I was a kid and my mother to Latin America and Europe, people would offer to buy my blue jeans for huge amounts of money. Everybody wanted our products. They They wanted our blue jeans, they wanted our transistor radios, they wanted our RCA Victrolas, they wanted American automobiles, which were the gold standard automobiles in the world. But more than that, they also, something much more important, they looked to our country for moral authority and for leadership. They wanted American leadership. They knew the difference between leadership and bullying. And they wanted our leadership. I went to Poland with my dad in 1964 and my mother and 3 of my siblings, 11 siblings. And we went to, it was a communist government then. They did not want us in the country. My father went uninvited. He had been invited by a human rights activist. And the government tried to black out in the press, they control the press. And so there was no news of our presence in the country. They blacked it all out. And in fact, before we left, my mother took us out shopping to buy American goods for the big orphanage, famous orphanage in Warsaw. And so we went out and we got to buy these wonderful gifts, like blue jeans and stuff for the kids. When we went to that orphanage, the Polish government had removed all the children because they didn't want us to have any contact with the Polish people. 2 days later, we were in Krakow and we went to the cathedral to visit the cardinal. Cardinal was a living saint. He had stood up to the communists, he had been jailed, he'd been tortured. Everybody knew in the country he was going to be beatified when he died, which he was, by the Catholic Church. He had inspired, his dignity and his piety had inspired this huge religious resurgence for the Catholic Church in Poland. And it was very exciting for us, the Catholic family, to be able to meet somebody who was actually, we knew was going to be a saint. And we went to that cathedral. When we went, the plaza outside of the central plaza in Krakow, it looks like it's a mile long. It's a huge, huge plaza. It was empty. Nobody knew we were there. We went in and we waited for the cardinal for 2 hours. Actually, there's a funny story. It's a little bit of a digression, but a young priest came and brought us into the kitchen and kept us there. And he made us chicken sandwiches, and he talked to us, he spoke English, and he talked to us, he wanted to talk about skiing. And he wanted to know all the ski areas in the United States and what it was. And 40 years later, he became Pope John Paul II. But anyway, when we then met with the cardinal, and when we were in there for about 4 hours. When we came out, there was 1 million people waiting for us outside. Wow. And it just spread by word of mouth throughout the whole city. The whole city came into that plaza to see my dad. And he pulled us out of the windows of the embassy limousine. We stood on the roof and he spoke to the crowd, and then they sang to us again and again. They wouldn't let us move. They lifted up the car. They sang to us "Sto lat," which means may you live forever. And they sang again and again and again the Polish national anthem. It was a criminal act to sing the Polish national anthem. And they just sang it again and again and again, this whole crowd. We saw that all over Europe. We went to France and got the same reception in Greece and Italy and the UK. People loved this country. We were beloved around the world. And one of the reasons for that, when my uncle, who had died, the year before, had said we should be projecting economic power abroad instead of military power. And he told his best friend, Ben Bradley, one of his 2 best friends, who was the editor of the Washington Post, he said, when Ben Bradley asked him, "What do you want on your gravestone as your epithet?" My uncle said, "He kept the peace." He said the principal job of a president of the United States is to keep our country out of war. Yeah. And he said he didn't want African children and Latin American and Asian kids, when they heard the word United States of America, to think of a soldier with a weapon. Instead, think of a Peace Corps volunteer. And think of the Kennedy Milk Program, which gave nutrients to children all over the world. And USAID, which was at that point, a legitimate agency trying to build middle classes in these newly decolonized country, and Alliance for Progress, which was doing the same thing. And because he was projecting economic power abroad, today there are more statues to him. Somebody yesterday from Colombia sent me a picture, a video of a hospital in the poorest neighborhood of Santa Marta named John F. Kennedy. There's more hospitals, more universities, more boulevards, streets, avenues named after John Kennedy than any other president, probably more than all of them combined. Because he made that calculation that the best way to empower our nation and to protect our nation was to project economic power abroad rather than military power. And he kept the country out of war. They wanted him to go into Laos. He refused to go. Daniel Ellsberg, who was then working for the Rand Corporation, was in the Pentagon, and he said there was a coup d'etat atmosphere at the Pentagon, that they regarded my uncle for not going into Laos as a traitor to the United States. He refused to go into Cuba, and during the Bay of Pigs, 4 months in May, 4 months after he came to office. He refused again to go into Cuba in '62 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he refused to send troops to Vietnam, combat troops. Eisenhower had the outgoing president 3 days before my uncle took the oath of office, and I was there when he did. I was a 7-year-old boy, and I turned 7 on January 17th, which was the day that Eisenhower gave what is now, in retrospect, probably the most important speech in American history, where he warned against the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would transform America, the exemplary democracy of the world, into a imperial state abroad and a surveillance state, a garrison state, a national security state at home, and that would impoverish the middle class through military expenditures. My uncle also had read Paul Kennedy's book, which was, Paul Kennedy, who's no relationship to us, but a famous historian at Yale who traced the decline of every empire over the past 500 years. Every single one of them killed themselves through overextending their military abroad. My uncle was against it, and he was surrounded by people, including people he trusted, his military brass, his intelligence apparatus, but people he actually trusted. Max Taylor, Averell Harriman, Douglas Dillon, many others, Bob McNamara, who were telling him, you have got to send 250,000 combat troops to Vietnam, or the government's going to collapse. And he said, it's their government. They have to fight. We can't fight their wars for them. But he did send 16,000 military advisors who were not allowed by the rules of engagement to participate in combat, but some of them did anyway. It was fewer troops than he sent to get one black man, James Meredith, into Old Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. But he sent 16,000 there. On October 22nd, 1963, he heard that a Green Beret had been killed in Vietnam, and he asked Walt Rostow for a casualty list. And Walt Rostow brought him a list of all the casualties to date in Vietnam. There were 75 Americans that died. And he said, that's too many, and I bring them all home. And that afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all American personnel out of Vietnam by end of 1965, with the first 1,000 out by December 63. That was a month later. 30 days to the day after he signed that order, he was murdered. And a week after that, the incoming president, LBJ, remanded National Security Order 263. And within a year, he had sent 250,000 troops over there, and it became an American war. And my father ran against the war, and was killed in the process. Martin Luther King, 2 months before my father. King had broken with the civil rights movement, other civil rights leader, and said, and become a peace activist. Because he said, this has to be our top priority because we cannot build a democratic state at home if we're committing violence. That violence is going to come home, the oppression is going to come home, and we're going to drain all the money away from the war on poverty to fight a war, in Asia. And he was killed in April. My father was killed in June. And these traumas, my uncles, that's my father, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and then the war in Vietnam itself, 9/11 and COVID. Those traumas pushed America down that road that Eisenhower had warned us about, until we're living today in the land that he predicted, a place where we can hardly call ourselves a democracy now, because so much of what we do is dictated by this, the military-industrial complex, which includes the medical-industrial complex, which, by the way, when Eisenhower did that speech, you go look at it, and he talks about the military, but he says, and that includes the federal scientific technocracy, which is part of the problem. So, that's where we are today, and now where we've got a new war. We're giving we gave $113 billion in March. We topped it off. Now this week, President Biden is asking for another $24 billion for a war that should have never have happened. That we had, that they tried twice to settle, and both the times the Russians agreed to settle twice. And both the times we torpedoed those settlement agreements. And my son, by the way, fought over there. Some of you know that, on the side of the Ukrainians. But we need to recognize the part that we played in that war. And the total budget, annual budget for CDC is $12 billion. The total annual budget of EPA is $12 billion. Scott was talking about the environment. That's all we've got for the environment in this country, $12 billion. But we're sending $113 billion over there, and we've killed now 400,000 Ukrainian kids. Each one has a mother. The kids that my son served with, many of them are dead. And it's a war that we've been lied to about and can't win. Now, in March, I've represented commercial fishermen my whole life, my whole career. I started out my career as an environmental lawyer representing commercial fishermen against polluters on the Hudson River. And so I have a lot of friends in the fishery, and one of my best friends is a guy called Keith Amato, who fished out of Provincetown, Chatham, and Wellfleet on the Cape. And he's my age. He's had a lot of injuries. It's a tough business. It's the most dangerous business. And he's now on full disability. His son-in-law runs the business, but he has no pension, and he relies on food stamps. He was getting $283 a month in food stamps. But because we've spent $8 trillion on useless wars since 2001, $8 trillion, we spent $16 trillion on COVID, which didn't get us much. That's $24 trillion. And it's no surprise we don't have a middle class, because the politicians don't come and say, we want to tax you in order to do these things, or we'd never agree to it if we had to pay up front. So they stack taxes through a stealth mechanism called inflation. It's a tax on the poor and the middle class, and so inflation has eroded the value of his $283 food stamps. The government tells us that food prices have gone up 38% in 2 years. The real price for chicken, eggs, and dairy is 76%. Oh, his food stamps have eroded by 76%. On March 1st, the same month that we topped off the Ukraine aid at $113 billion, he got a robocall from the government telling him that his food stamps were being cut by $23 a month. 90%. He was already switching around ingredients at the grocery store to get out through the checkout line. And now he's down to one meal a day and going into debt. So, and then the same month the Fed printed $300 billion unanticipated to bail out the Silicon Valley Bank. We have a lot of money when the bankers need it, and we have a lot of money when the military-industrial complex needs it. But when regular Americans who have worked hard their whole lives, built this country, enriched our palate, our culture, our history, when they need food to eat, to stay alive, we don't have it for them. And there's something wrong with that. And Mitch McConnell was asked the same month, the same week that Joe Biden sent Boris Johnson over to torpedo the peace accords. The Russians were already withdrawing. And they had, both sides had initialed the accord. In March of 2022, a month later in April, Biden sent Boris Johnson over there to force Zelensky to tear up the agreement. That same month, Mitch McConnell was asked about this huge expenditure to Ukraine. He said, don't worry, because it's not really going to Ukraine. It's going to U.S. military contractors, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Lockheed. Who do you think owns all of those companies? Every one of them. BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Those companies own each other, too. It's really this one BMS company that is strip mining us, and it's a money laundering scheme disguised as a humanitarian mission. And we need leaders who are going to understand this, who are going to start talking about this corrupt merger of state and corporate power. I'm going to tell you another thing, is that, and this very quickly, just because it allows me to say the names of these companies again. I was in Iowa this week, and the big issue in Iowa now is 3 pipelines, 3,300 miles of pipelines. They're carbon capture pipelines. And I'm an environmentalist, and for 40 years I've been fighting carbon capture because the myth is a boondoggle. It does nothing for the environment. I'm a partner in the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the country. We were the biggest investors in Tesla. We built the biggest solar plant in this country, and because I'm in that business, I know what a boondoggle is, and I know this does nothing for the environment. It's complete hoax, and they're taking this carbon from the ethanol plants and supposedly bringing it across 6 states and injecting it into deep wells. We're supposed to live forever, but we know that it always gets out. And it does bad things when it gets out, including kill people and cause brain damage. But North Dakota's already denied a permit. They said, we're not going to let you do it. And it's forced these companies to admit, or to acknowledge at least indirectly, that what they really are doing is they're shipping that carbon up to the Bakken oil fields to deep well inject it into the exhausted wells in order to give another 20 years of life to the Bakken oil fields. Oh, it's increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And they're condemning 3,300 miles of the best farmland in the country and taking it from these farmers through eminent domain for a public purpose, which is really just and of course, the owner of the biggest of those projects is BlackRock. And 80% of the people in Ohio say they don't want it. 46 counties through which it goes have petitioned the Senate to shut it down. But the companies that are building it have given $1.6 million to a handful of officials, including the governor. And it's going to go through, unless we get a different president who will end it through FERC, which I will do. And here's the punchline. President Trump and President Biden passed this tax credit, which is now in the Inflation Reduction Act, which awards for carbon capture a certain amount, about $1 a gallon. The total value of that pipeline over a 10-year period to the three companies is $173 billion of our taxpayer money that is going for something. And by the way, all of the officials who are greasing the skids to make this happen are Republicans. And I'm not saying any, the only reason I'm telling you that is every one of them has said that they do not believe in global warming. So they're not even pretending that this is a public benefit. They're saying there's no problem out there, but there is a solution that's good for BlackRock. But they're strip mining, this is just strip mining. $173 billion worth of wealth, more than the Ukraine war. So, they got all of these ways, and I am going to get up there and I'm going to end it. And let me just tell you one of the things I'm going to do, and then I'll shut up. Johnny, Patty.
We love you, Bobby.
And I told you. The thing that kicked off more than any other thing the great prosperity in this country was the GI Bill and the bills after World War II that made it easy for GIs to buy houses, to get into houses with low mortgage payments. So what I'm going to do as soon as I get in there is I'm going to start working on the tax code to make it very, very unprofitable for these big companies to come in and buy, millions of houses. And they shouldn't be. Our children should not have to compete against these giant, billion. And of course, the way they do it is because they have better access to capital, because they have lower interest costs. So they, of course, can go and take all the land in our country. And by the way, there's now all kinds of articles that show that the best foreign land in Europe is Ukraine. And our arrangement with Ukraine is we're going to give you all this money. You have to pay it back. And the way you pay it back is through austerity programs, beginning with something they call the land market, which forces all the farmers in Ukraine essentially to sell their land to BlackRock. So, the Ukrainian people, 400,000 of them have died to protect their land from the Russians. Their land is being taken from them by BlackRock. The system is rigged, and it's rigged. Thomas Jefferson's vision of our country was, he said, the only way democracy would survive is if it was based on widespread diverse ownership of land by tens of thousands of independent freeholds owned by families, each with a stake in our system. And we cannot afford to have a single mega corporation essentially own all of them. I mean, they're buying all the farmland too, but to own all our single family homes, and our kids are having to compete against these behemoths because they have those low costs. I'm going to change the tax code to make it very, very difficult for them to compete with our children. I'm also going to make a 3% mortgage available to Americans, as many as I can, hopefully in the millions. And the way that I'm going to do it, and without raising the budget deficit, which is really important, that we get off of that addiction. And the way that I'm going to do that is, that if you have a rich uncle and he'll co-sign your loan, you can get a much lower rate because the bank is looking at his credit rating instead of yours. So I'm going to give every American a rich uncle, and he's called Uncle Sam. And I'm going to get Uncle Sam to backstop these mortgages, and then we're going to finance those mortgages by selling 3% tax-free bonds, and we're going to give the first $500,000 to teachers, and because we need to support education. And those homes will only be available to people who live in that community and are employed in that community and remain in that community. And we're going to start The Great Prosperity Bill started with the housing boom, and I'm going to use this methodology to launch a housing boom in this country, because that's what I needed. This is what I wanted to see the people on that debating screen talk about last night, about not, instead of screaming at each other and talking about how tough they're going to be on China, on Russia, on crime, on on immigrants, on Appalachia, on the environment, et cetera, to tell us, how they're going to actually return the middle class to this country and help people. And I want to hear their ideas, because a lot of them are probably really good ideas, and we can learn from each other. I think we need to start insisting that our politicians talk like that and think like that, and think bigger than just, these shibboleths and platitudes and cliches that, come out of the Reagan era, and actually give us, tell us how they're going to solve the big problems that all of us are facing. So anyway, I was going to answer questions tonight, but I really want to get Johnny and Anna Christina Cash up here singing Jackson, which I love to hear from. There's a couple of you who want to ask me questions. I'm going to go in the back afterward, and we can talk, and I'll be happy to answer any questions then. So thank you all very much.